My name is Faith Harper, and I am your super fancy keynote speaker for this conference that is now all online. And I am not doing any video with this because at this point my roots are terrible. And one of my dear friends is also my hairdresser, and he's offered to sneak in and fix my hair, but I don't want to put him at risk, and I also don't want to embarrass him by showing people my hair right now. So we're all doing audio. Um, so first thing, I do a lot of keynotes, and I don't tend to do stuff. Well, first of all, I'm not a politician, so I'm not one of those people that does keynotes that's basically just like a love letter to myself and please vote for me. And I also don't do, like these kind of rah-rah, we're so special and we work so hard and we're so wonderful keynotes. I mean, we all know that we work really, really hard, and none of us are in it for the money because none of us are driving Mercedes. So I don't need to point that out for any of y'all. I tend to do keynotes that are about, what's the next big thing that we need to change? What is the next thing that we need to focus on as a community that's invested in mental health care and recovery? And so my original idea for the keynote is, unsurprisingly, if you know my work, was trauma-informed care. This is why I don't get invited to parties. It's because I talk about trauma all the time. And so when talking to Jason about this keynote, I said, hey, how often are you talking about trauma? And he said, we do that a little bit, but I think that would be super appropriate for the keynote. That's not been a centered conversation. I said, awesome. And then, of course, we had the COVID-19 hit, and it made me start to wonder, is this really relevant at this point? Is this the kind of keynote that makes sense? And, first thought is, well, I don't know what would be. Does anything feel relevant anymore? And then I realized, yeah, it actually really is relevant. I live in San Antonio, where one of the first things we did, for those of you who don't know, San Antonio is actually a very liberal city. We are a blue island city in the South, just like Austin is. We're a sanctuary city, those kinds of things. And one of the first things we did is we released, even before everything else hit, even before we went into stay-at-home orders, they released a couple thousand nonviolent prisoners from our local jails in order to, reduce numbers and prevent spread. And this made national news because the question then begs is, if you can do that, why are we holding individuals in prison anyway? Kind of just, I mean, we've been having a lot of these conversations in general, like why would we not let people work from home if they can work from home effectively? Why would we let people go home rather than keep them in prison if they can be home and be safe? And I just saw this morning that Senator Booker, had introduced some legislation allowing people to have an alternative to the prison system where they can be monitored and perhaps even, I don't know, get treatment rather than be in prison, which would keep them safe from spread, and offer them the opportunity to actually have some true rehabilitation and recovery. So that made me realize that what we're talking about here still makes complete sense. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, even though we can't have it in person, and hopefully one day we can. Because I'm never going to be done talking about trauma. So next time you see me, I will still be talking about trauma, I am sure. So title of this presentation is Shifting the Paradigm, because I really wanted to talk about trauma-informed care within the judicial system, in case you hadn't figured that part out yet. So this is a very specific basket design that comes from the Choctaw Nation. My father is Choctaw. And my mother's Irish, which is why I'm kind of weird and wonky looking, like I was kind of put together with spare parts as a human being. I particularly love this pattern because it represents the Good Road, also sometimes known as the Good Red Road. And we have a tradition that if somebody falls, this is the path that everybody walks in life, or that we're trying to walk in life. And yeah, the way I was raised, if somebody falls off the road, you go get them. You don't get back on the road without them. And that's a very important stance that I grew up with. I remember my father telling me he had a very dear friend who was more conservative than us, and pretty much everybody was probably more conservative than my family. We're obviously pretty liberal. And he said, but he's a really good man, and he takes such good care of his family, and I wish I could just get him to realize that the entirety of the world is his family. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this presentation, is understanding that the entirety of the world is our family. And if we understand that, and we understand that people are off the road, we need to collect our fellow travelers. And we can't walk the road if there's other people still off to the sides. That's just not how human beings are supposed to be in the world. That's what I was raised with, and I'm sure a lot of you were as well. And that's kind of what I want us to hold as our core truth when we discuss these issues. So one of the first things I did when thinking about this presentation was, I turned to social media, because that's what we do, right? And I said, hey, y'all, okay, so y'all being, I'm Texan, so y'all is singular and all y'all is plural. So all y'all, what would you say the problems with the prison system are? I think I just put this out on Facebook, and curious what my friends would say. And so my friends, as other angry liberals, had a lot to say about, the fact that it's the privatization has made it a for-profit system, that the pipeline to prison starts in preschool, that there's a complete destruction of people's physical and mental health, the fact that boredom is used as punishment and fear is used as control, that it's another form of colonization of people of color, that it is modern slavery, and the reference to Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, came up, and it didn't come from me. I've got great friends. So when I'm saying this isn't my list, these are my friends' lists, so I can push this off on other people. There's a lack of true rehabilitation. There's a focus on imprisonment rather than prevention. The large numbers of nonviolent offenders, which we saw in San Antonio when thousands of people were released because they were nonviolent, the lack of adequate health care, the focus on strategies that don't do anything to deter crime. Workers earn far less than minimum wage, if anything, and there's really interesting research on that. There's no focus on reintegration or support for positive outcomes upon release. Good luck getting a job once you have a record. And then charging inmates and families exorbitant fees. So, this is just what came up as what people responded to in my Facebook feed, and they were all really accurate. Again, I have smart and thoughtful friends, and when I went back and researched what people were saying, and some of this I had known, like I had already read The New Jim Crow, and some of it, really kind of slapped me in the face when I looked at the numbers in a really stark way. So some of these things I'm going to talk about, and I only have 30 minutes, and I got to behave. Nobody can sit and listen to my voice all day, I don't think. And if you're into that, then good for you. A little creepy, but okay. But I still only have 30 minutes. But I also, the charge is to change things. So I wanted to give y'all really good information. I did a deep dive, and I tried to curate out some of the best stuff. So when we're looking at making changes, I wanted to just say, hey, so I listened to this presentation in quarantine by this Dr. Faith chick, and she had some really good stats, some stuff that's really relevant if we're making some changes in our system. So let me show you what's out there. I have found that changing systems is doable when you have numbers to back it up, because people love numbers. So I did a lot of research into these issues, and that's what we're going to start with. So then I went back to, okay, there's a lot of problems. So if I had one wish, what would that one wish be? Knowing that we have all these people that have fallen off the road, and there's a lot of problems tied to this system. And if I could only do one thing, what would that one thing be to make some kind of change? And that's when I came into the idea of bringing trauma-informed care into the judicial system. Because if you're doing that and doing it right, the other stuff takes care of itself. You can't do good trauma-informed care Not just saying, oh yes, we recognize that people have trauma, which is, just awareness, but really good trauma-informed care means changing everything. So it's kind of one of those ways of saying, I wish for 10 more wishes, if you say, I want to bring trauma-informed care into a system. So one of the first things that struck me, and I already worked in the system. I graduated with my bachelor's in 1995 and worked as a case manager. So then I went back to grad school in 2005 and started my master's then. So I've been in the system this whole time and did what most people do when they go back to graduate school. Like, it'd be really cool to make like $40,000 a year. I'm really tired of making 28. So I'm going to go to graduate school. And this is and I was already working on an assertive community treatment team at the time, and I was actually the court liaison, or actually the systems liaison, if somebody was judicial system involved, not just within the court system, but with child protective services, adult protective services, any of those organizations. I was their go-to to help them navigate that system. So I was not starry-eyed. Like I knew that there was problematic things. But this still struck me. The 3 biggest mental health facilities in the United States in 2005, and I was curious, I looked at this again, here we are in 2020, if there had been any changes. So we have these 3. So if you've never seen these before, that is the LA County Jail, Cook County, and Rikers Island. And there has been a change since 2005. LA County Jail used to be number 1, Cook County was number 2, and Rikers was number 3. And now Cook County is number 1, and LA County is number 2, and Rikers is still held at number 3. So in 15 years, they still remain the 3 biggest mental health hospitals in the United States. And that's sort of psychically overwhelming for me to realize how poorly we're treating people and how many people are not on the road with us, and that they're in the judicial system. We're talking about people that are specifically in jail at this point who have severe mental health issues. But again, that's also not these 3 institutions, right? In 45 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, a prison or jail in that state holds more individuals with serious mental illness, serious chronic mental illness, than the largest remaining state psychiatric hospitals. And I know how big our psychiatric hospitals are in Texas. So there are more people with serious mental illness in Texas than are in our 7 or 8 state hospitals. An example coming from the Treatment Advocacy Center in Ohio, there's 10 state prisons and 2 county jails. Each hold more mentally ill people than the largest remaining state hospital. So there are more mentally ill persons in jail and prisons than in hospitals, period. So the mental illness policy org. So for example, Oregon, where this presentation was supposed to take place, there are 3 people with mental illness in prison for every 1 person getting treatment in a hospital. And in Texas, where I live, that number is almost 8. It's 7.8 people in jail for everyone. Now, and then also in Texas, we have jail diversion. That's available throughout the state. I'm in one of the 2 counties that actually practices that, but getting people into jail diversion is still pretty difficult. So even with jail diversion in Texas, we still have an 8-to-1 ratio of people in prison rather than in treatment. So I want to talk a little bit about mental health and judicial system. So 64% of local jail inmates, 56% of state prisoners, and 45% of federal prisoners have symptoms of a serious mental illness. And this comes from the U.S. Department of Justice Bureaus of Justice Statistics. This is their own numbers, okay? The number of inmates with mental health diagnosis continues to increase, as does the severity of those diagnoses. And that comes from the Pew Charitable Trust research. And you can see these are all fairly recent numbers. The BJS numbers are a little older. We tend to get federal numbers a little more slowly. What was interesting though, so the Marshall Project did a Freedom of Information Act and found that the Bureau of Prisons, they went and looked at the Bureau of Prisons' own documentation, and they've been systematically lowering the number of individuals who qualify for care. So we know the numbers are high, and the Marshall Project is like, okay, so what's going on with treatment though? And so by filing an FOIA, getting it approved, they found that the Bureau of Prisons have currently classified just 3% of inmates of having a mental illness serious enough to require regular treatment. So even though we know at least half of prisoners in any particular setting have a pretty severe mental illness, only 3% of them are getting treatment because we're lowering the standard of care for their treatment by the Bureau of Prisons. So why are we lowering the standard of care? To save money, and that always works super, super well. So this is what the Fresno County Jail did fairly recently. This was less than 10 years ago. So the Fresno County Jail, their psychiatric services was under the jurisdiction of Fresno County Behavioral Health Department, but they faced a $16 million budget deficit, and that was at the end of 2005. So fixing that was handed off to the Department of Health. So they needed to cut expenses. So they got rid of their 11 to 7 nursing shift. That always ends really, really well for everyone involved. So the guards from 11 to 7 did all the mental health screening because prison guards are, really, really good at that. And I'm sure they enjoyed having extra things that they needed to do. And obviously they were equipped to do this and had all the appropriate training to, ascertain if somebody had a mental health issue or not. So anyone who came in from 11 to 7 had a mental health screening done by a prison guard. And they also drastically cut their psychiatric drug formulary. So they reduced costs nearly 89% from 2011 to 2012, which saved them $1.5 million in 2011-2012 year. Except those problems, not doing appropriate psychiatric screenings, cutting their drug formulary, so people came in being used to one drug and no longer being able to get it, so being put on something else, maybe having been on an antipsychotic and being given an antidepressant, and so obviously going into detox, going into psychosis again, ended up back in the state hospital because of it from the prison system. Their total state hospital bill because of the lack of care was $8 million. So they ended up losing $6.5 million by cutting $1.5 million by changing their system up. So, they think, okay, we're going to save money, but, sort of typically what we see over and over again in our country is we're not saving money when we do these things. We're actually losing money down the line somewhere else. And this is one of those little snapshot cases where we can see that the losses are actually enormous when we don't care for people properly. And this breakdown actually showed up in Prison Legal News if you wanted to look up more about that story. So this is the part where I start ranting about the stuff that gets me disinvited from parties. This is where we start talking about trauma specifically. So, we're talking about mental health issues, and that's really important. The trauma numbers are even more significant. It's estimated that 85% of women in correctional settings have an early experience of physical and or sexual abuse. In a recent study of people participating in jail diversion programs across the country, so these are people that are not in the prison system but are in a diversion program, both women and men almost universally report a history of significant traumatic experience prior to incarceration. Numbers for women were 95.5% and 88.6% for men. And most individuals in the criminal justice system were victims before they were offenders. And this is really important. A lot of our psychiatric issues stem from trauma, and the trauma in and of itself is something that requires treatment. So, and then the victimization continues within the system. So, for example, a study of the Alabama prison system by the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, this was just in 2017, and again, this was the government studying itself, found that incidents of violence had doubled in the preceding 5 years. So just over a 5-year period, 2012 to 2017, prison staff accept the high levels of violence and sexual abuse as a normal course of business. So I love Angela Davis's quote from 2003, where she said, "The prison has become a black hole where contemporary capitalism is deposited. Mass imprisonment generates profits as it devours social wealth, and thus it tends to reproduce the very conditions that lead people to prison." So whatever created an offender was already an offense. So what I'm saying is people were hurt before they hurt someone else, and then they're put into a system where they are continued to be hurt by others. And then for most inmates with mental illness are still waiting for decent care. And you can see this story is just a little over a year old, this NPR story by Christine Herman. So this is just a screenshot of the article you can look at. So we have individuals that are in the system and they're traumatized by their inability to access appropriate care. So I want to talk to you a little bit about trauma if trauma-informed care is not your thing. We have typically thought of trauma in response to war using different terminology. So in civil war is being visited by ghosts. We saw people come back from the Civil War and, you know, they would wake up sweating, screaming. People that had issues after wartime were often referred to as being visited by ghosts. Shell shock was the term that we used in World War I. Battle fatigue was the term used in World War II. And these are all early expressions of what we now refer to as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, but what's interesting about that is discussions of other type of trauma were immediately treated with derision. So early on, Sigmund Freud had tried to expose the regularity of childhood sexual abuse. He was shunned by the medical community for doing so. Sigmund Freud was an MD, so we talk about the, being the father of psychology. What he was realizing that all these women he were treating were being sexually abused, and when he tried to speak about that, people told him he was nuts. So he had to make a choice. He had, like, if he wanted to, propel this theory forward and create this new way of treating people, this psychology, this talking cure, he couldn't say that all of these men were sexually abusing their wives and daughters and sons. So he had to reframe it as hysteria. So, we've had people try to talk about trauma in other instances and not be able to. So that's why a lot of times trauma has been couched in wartime terms, because that's something that has been understood and even revered. That, this is something that heroes go through. This is why even now the VA finds that there is less stigma about having PTSD than there is about having depression. So, but even so, PTSD was not recognized as a formal diagnosis until it was added to the DSM-3 in 1980. And there was a lot of controversy surrounding this decision. This was a thing because we were saying that you could have a mental health disorder based on external events. It wasn't something internal to your biochemistry, like depression, like anxiety, like schizophrenia. Like you have a brain that works a little bit different and it's creating this issue for you. We're saying things happening outside of you are creating a psychiatric condition for you. And that meant changing everything that we knew and understood about psychology. So that was a big fight. And it was the Vietnam vets who won that fight for all of us. So that's why that was a thing. So that is why we've only had PTSD as a diagnosable condition since 1980. A comprehensive model for understanding and treating trauma was published in the book Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman in 1992. So I am old enough to really sort of remember this timeline, and a lot of y'all are as well. The idea of trauma-informed care is really very new. Okay, so, and then I want to talk about the role of the body. I'm a somatic practitioner, and I think that that's really important, and we're understanding more and more every day. Literally new research is coming out every day. So the role of somatics in trauma recovery started getting diagnosed a few years after Judith Herman's work was released. So Peter Levine's book, Waking the Tiger, was first published in 1997. So a few years after Judith Herman's work came out, Peter Levine started writing about how somebody was holding trauma in their body. He only, because I was talking about what he saw, there wasn't like a scientific rationale for it, but he saw that people were holding trauma in their body. Stephen Porges published his first research on polyvagal theory about the same time period, 1996. But the idea that Porges's work might provide a scientific basis for somatic trauma recovery and inform efforts to provide more efficacious treatment is really new. That's 2011. That's less than 10 years ago that we realized that what Stephen Porges started to understand about the vagus nerve and stuff made sense in terms of what we also understood about trauma. And Porges and Peter Levine have partnered up and done work together and stuff that trauma is something that is held in the body. And so we're just now starting to understand that trauma-informed care requires a better understanding of the body if we're going to help people heal. That's less than a decade old. So this is, when we talk about polyvagal theory, we're saying that, we have the brain, the spinal cord, we have this whole nervous system that trauma is held within. So going by the most simple definition, we're saying trauma is an injury to the nervous system. And that's really important. We understood in 1980 that something can happen to us that's causing a psychiatric issue, but it's hurting the whole body. The entirety of the nervous system is being injured by trauma responses. So telling someone with PTSD to not be trauma reactive is like telling someone with epilepsy to stop seizing. And of course, that's what we're doing in the judicial system every day, right? We're seeing people with trauma responses and we're telling them, stop it, which is no different than somebody having a seizure and we're telling them to stop it. We're seeing people with nervous system injuries and we're telling them to stop seizing. And it's not okay and it's not acceptable. And this is the next thing that we need to band together and change. So let's talk about system acknowledgement. We can say trauma understanding, that we're trauma aware, that we're trauma informed, that we're trauma sensitive. And all these terms speak to an acknowledgement of the prevalence and impact of trauma. We can say, yes, all these statistics, like 95% of people have like a pretty significant trauma before they end up in the judicial system. Oh yes, that's so terrible. And we can feel very, very bad about it. Or we can actually make a system paradigm shift and we can have trauma-specific treatments throughout the system. That's where treatment directly affects the impact of trauma on an individual's life and facilitates trauma recovery. They're designed to treat the actual consequences of trauma, understanding this is a nervous system injury and people need to be treated in such a manner that all these trauma-specific treatment models should be delivered within the context of a relational approach that's based on the empowerment of the survivor and create a feeling of safety. It's like this, with the Alameda County Behavioral Health Services went back and read Judith Herman's book. They may have. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a paradigm shift of understanding that trauma is the root of so much of this, and that needs to be the focus. So if Cory Booker's bill passes, for example, and we put people under a different level of care because they're a part of the judicial system, what if they were in trauma recovery that was somatically based and they were learned to manage their nervous system in a different way rather than sitting in a jail cell? So an essential, and this is SAMHSA, what every judge needs to know about trauma. SAMHSA wrote this for judges. An essential component of being trauma informed is to understand these behaviors not as character flaws or symptoms of mental illness, but as strategies or behavioral adaptations developed to cope with the physical and emotional impact of past trauma. This paradigm shift does not imply a lack of responsibility for illegal behavior, but it does provide an opportunity to apply approaches that are the most effective in promoting recovery and reducing recidivism. I love that quote. So trauma-specific treatments are effective. And this is where if you're trying to make some kind of change where you are, this is the kind of research you're going to want. When we do trauma-specific care, it works. Weird, right? So after implementing a trauma-informed institutional environment in the mental health unit at a facility in Massachusetts, there was a 62% decrease in inmate assaults on staff and a 54% decrease on inmate assaults. And this was just in 2014 that was published. Moreover, there's evidence to suggest that trauma-informed services resulted in a decrease in other behavioral and mental health situations, a 60% decline in the number of suicide attempts, a 33% decline in the need for one-on-one mental health watches, and a 16% decline in psychiatric petitions. Trauma-informed care works, and it reduces costs. We're talking about saving money. If you treat people effectively, that does save money, and it also saves lives. So the entirety of the system, when I said, like, if you have one wish, what would it be? The entirety of the system, because trauma informed through decriminalization, decarceration, deprofitization, which is probably a word that I made up, jail diversion, early intervention, education, policy and procedure overhaul, funding priorities, addressing all forms of systemic inequality in society change if we're trauma-informed, because they have to be if we're doing trauma-informed care appropriately. So wherever you are in the system, trauma-informed care will affect all of these issues, is my hope. And I'm middle-aged. I got decades still to go to continue to fight for this. So this is what we're heading for. What does the paradigm shift need? Like, I'm saying, okay, lady, that's, good plans, but how are you going to do this? Paradigm shifts need time. Creating a trauma-informed correctional organization takes 3 to 5 years. Like, this is not something that happens overnight. I say that I have seen big changes happen quickly. I've been part of them. I've worked with advocates and wonderful people who have made big changes quickly by saying no, absolutely not, and having the voice and authority to do so. So sometimes we can make big changes quickly, but generally speaking, changing a large organization takes time. So if this is something that you're wanting to do, realizing that there is a commitment to retraining the old guard, having some of the most stubborn old guard decide that they want to go somewhere else, having them see the benefit of it and begrudgingly, connect to this new way of thinking, those kinds of things. And obviously it takes a lot of training. So all individuals that work in the justice system need training, not just on what trauma is, but how it impacts the brain and the body, that this is the nervous system, and that how to effectively interact with someone experiencing a nervous system trauma response. So programs like Seeking Safety, for example, are really good because they're meant to train literally everyone, janitorial staff up to, the C-suites, the CFOs, CEOs, those kind of people. So, and yes, such trainings exist. SAMHSA does have the GAIN Center for Behavioral Health and Justice Transformation, and they do provide trauma-informed response training for criminal justice professionals. I don't have any affiliation with the GAIN Center. I was just looking for referrals for y'all. So GAIN Center would be like a good starting point because they are criminal justice specific. Mostly, we need time, we need training, but mostly one of these things that we all need is are these interlocking person-serving systems need in order to create and maintain organizational change as a champion. I mentioned a minute ago that I have brought organizations into trauma-informed care because I was the champion. I had a lot of letters after my name. I had a lot of authority and was able to fight for things that are important. I've seen people do that without a lot of letters after their name and authority, who were just really passionate about it and really fought for what worked and continued to do things that worked, and other people saw the benefit of that, and so started to follow along, and it gained momentum as it kind of, picked up more followers and stuff as it continued to roll along. So being the champion in the system makes a big difference. I've seen interns being at one place here in San Antonio affect change throughout a whole federal system just by saying in their one program in San Antonio, no, that's not appropriate. I'm not going to do that. That's not okay. And, I'm going to tell my supervisor on you. And their program saying, oh, you're right, and we should probably change that, and then that changing the entirety of the federal program. So I've seen it happen. This is not just me being a Pollyanna. It can happen. And I've also, cried myself to sleep at night because it can be really difficult. So I've seen both sides of that, and I understand why this is so difficult, and I also really believe that this is very, very important. And so here can be like, somebody should do something, and the issue is we're the someones. And this is the something that we need to do. PTSD is a real physical injury. It's not a social or political opinion. And we are in a very interesting time right now where we're having to make necessary changes in how the judicial system works because of COVID-19. So we're going to have very interesting opportunities and information to advocate for this kind of work as we see that we don't have to go about as business as normal if people who are nonviolent have other opportunities to keep them and the people around them from getting sick. Why don't we also help people actually get better in other ways? We're actually have a unique opportunity to do some really good work right now, which I'm really excited about. So where do we start with this? We talk. For those of you essential employees, I went to this conference. Well, we didn't go to it. We sat and listened to it in our pajamas. This ranty chick, Dr. Faith, was saying, we start talking about this. We advocate, training, provide it, find it, ask for it, apply for grants for it. Weirdly, finding operational money is really, really hard, but finding training money is really easy. I don't know why that is, that we can find money for training easier than we can find money to keep the lights on, but there we go. Partner with other agencies and agents of change. Find who's doing it and partner with them. Again, apply for grants and get legal support. The legal support part is really interesting, and this is where your bosses are like, stop listening to her. Because remember those examples from earlier? They came from press coverage of successful lawsuits. So under the 1976 Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court affirmed that prisoners have constitutional rights to adequate medical attention and concluded that the Eighth Amendment is violated when corrections officials display deliberate indifference to inmates' medical needs. So when I talked about a couple of those cases of people not getting appropriate care, I showed you the screenshot from the NPR case. And the case where the Bureau was bringing it down to like only 3% of people got adequate care and stuff. They were sued for that, and they were sued successfully. So I'm not saying that, we have to necessarily sue for the rights for trauma-informed care, but because not everything has to be a lawsuit. I've also been very successful in getting amicus briefs from legal advocacy organizations. I don't want a retaliatory IRS audit for saying that we should have more legal involvement, but I have done that. Again, I did a lot of court liaison work, so I would connect to legal advocacy groups and ask for an amicus brief in support of what my client was going through, and I would get them, and they would really help. So having some kind of legal involvement doesn't require getting the ACLU involved in a big lawsuit. Sometimes it does, and that's okay, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we just need some support, and that can sometimes. Forcing change is necessary. A lot of times we don't get our rights by politely asking for them. Sometimes, suggesting that there's some legal weight behind it can make a big difference. So a lot of times I do a lot of advocacy type training, and I use this slide a lot. So here y'all go. You have been assigned this mountain to be shown others that it can be moved. And then if you want to send me nasty notes, you can do so here. Social media, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all those good places as the Intimacy Doctor. And these are my websites and my email. And thank you so much for hanging in there and listening to me rant about trauma and what we need to do to change the judicial system to care for those who have fallen off the good red road and that we need to get back on the road with us.